We're now going to talk about the alpha omega, which is almost like the heart of the device. It's like the central, it's like the core sort of part of the device, and it's the part of the device which is illustrated in the symbol, and also the part which actually sort of is responsible for attracting and spinning the energy. And basically, to begin with, it all starts with the concept of, just as a brief overview of feedback. And the way it works is, this system, to be efficient, works by literally, it works by the first concept. I'll just change pens, make it a bit bolder. The alpha omega is responsible for, again, everything seems to run in two. Everything seems to do at least one function, two functions. The first thing it does is vortex and spin the energy. And basically what that does is, that's the most efficient way to accumulate energy. That's how black holes work, that's how galaxies work, that's how tornadoes work. It appears on the micro and macro scale in nature. Accumulation is by spin, basically. A vortex spinning energy is the most powerful, stable system to accumulate energy, because once it's vortexing, it becomes very stable, and it actually can perpetuate itself if the resistance is removed, and that's exactly what the pyramid does. It takes away the resistance so that it doesn't hit a lower threshold, and it can spin all the way up to such a high rate that it can actually get some real effects happening. And the second system, which is incorporated into the spin, is feedback. And what that basically is recycling the energy. So the vortex is the spin, and the feedback is recycling. And it's not the same thing, because the circuit must be designed in a way so that it can feed back the energy. Rather than just having it spin, it runs through the circuit. And to illustrate how that works is really simple, and I think the feedback system is the future of technology, and vortex, because that's the age-old way to the ancients with their accumulating energy. They do this with their mind, but this machine is a physical way to do it, is to spin the energy up to great potential and feed it back into itself, constantly feeding back as it's being pumped in. And what that looks like on a circuit, on a illustration, is you've got energy in, so ether in, it's coming in, it's coming in, the arrow represents the ether. The ether comes in, it hits, it goes through the different layers, like the vacuum layer, etc. It's coming and it's feeding into the system from wherever it comes from, the human aura, the environment, wherever. It's just an input. This arrow represents ether coming in. And there's a gap, where it feeds in is where there's the gap in the circuit. There is a gap, which I'll explain shortly. And so the energy is coming in, it goes down the first point of the circuit, which is the alpha tip. This tip here, the alpha tip, actually, if energy's coming in, it's going to start here at this tip, where there's the gap in the circuit, that gap I was talking about. The energy, this is the pathway in. This alpha point is the pathway in. And basically, that represents this point here, which I'm going to draw, just that little point. It goes around the whole circuit, because the whole circuit is simple, it's in series, and where it ends is that ring, the lower omega ring. One of these things. Ooh. This ring, the lower ring in the pyramid, this is a flat one, this is an old design, it's supposed to be, it doesn't work, but it's supposed to be slightly, you know, the cross section of the sphere, but it just illustrates the ring. So the energy's coming in, runs down the path of the alpha tip, goes around, hits the ring, and jumps back to the beginning. So this section of 3 points is very important, because this is what allows the whole thing to start accumulating energy. The energy comes in from the pyramid, the 4 points, the 5 points of the pyramid to the center. It goes to the alpha tip, which is this point, goes around the circuit to the lower omega ring, jumps back. So two things are happening here. Number one is the energy is coming in to the system, and two, it's feeding back on itself. So what that means is, if you're not losing energy out of this circuit here, and the energy is being pumped in, the only thing it can possibly do is accumulate more and more and more energy. Builds up, basically. Haven't drawn it very well. So the energy's coming in and it's feeding back within that closed system. So it has to build up potential, and it does, and that's how it works. That's how it works. If the resistance value here is okay, in the sense that if it passes through the case fast enough, and this into the vacuum sphere, into the vacuum, so this is atmosphere and this is the vacuum in here. Once it gets into the vacuum, it's free, it doesn't have its resistance, so it can do what it wants. It's like being liberated ether. It can do what it wants. It's completely free to move really fast or really slow. And so it's feeding in, being sucked in, because it's attracted by the shape of the pyramid, and it's going to make it to the first point with the alpha, go around the system, feeding back on itself, building up more and more and more and more, while it's constantly being fed in at the same time. So that's how the system builds up power and pressure, and it's because of that gap in the circuit, and the circuit runs in series. Basically, it's that's the art of how the circuit, charges itself up and can continue to do so. It's really efficient way to do it, and it's really simple in the scheme of things. So that's that system. This won't draw the schematic of the, I guess I have to in a way, but I won't explain it, the schematic part of it, that comes later. But what have we got? So on a side view, we've I'll just quickly show you the parts. That's the coil, the omega coil, roughly. That's pretty correct, that one. that's been made. That's laser cut. It's really nicely made. You have to take out all those sections there, and you actually have to support the coil because just make a note here so I don't forget to explain something. You have to support it, but you can't. It's very delicate procedure. You have to. It's just a coil. It runs counterclockwise from out to in, which I'll explain later why that is. And yeah, but it has to be supported, or the coil will fall apart or distort. So it's supported by transparent. I prefer to use mica. Mica as a material to support it without blocking the energy. But yeah, that's not relevant to the design. That's making the design possible to build. And the alpha, which goes through. This is not going to show up very well, I don't think. It goes through the omega like that. Or this is downwards. But it's not touching where it goes through either, because what happens is the circuit starts here, but when you tune it differently while it started, you pull the vacuum, and because of the difference in the diameter of gap, in the length of the gap, it will jump from the center to the alpha. So it changes circuitry so that it can start to vortex once it's accumulated enough energy, which I'll explain. So basically, to illustrate the circuit, you've got your alpha tip here, which is connected to the alpha ring, because there's two rings which are identical in shape, one above the other, as you saw in the pyramid. If you ever want to refer to anything, refer to the video I took of the pyramid, because it's three-dimensional, very easy to perceive because it's 3D. This is all going to be 2D. But yeah, the top ring, the top copper ring, and then it literally, it connects, runs in series, goes through the first coil and magnet, which I'll explain later, goes through the mercury and salt file, goes back through the second coil of magnet, this is like a mirror system, runs through the box, which I'll explain, the starting mechanism, it's the starter engine, the starter motor, and when it gets to this point, it splits. Both parts are connected. It goes in the coil, and it's not touching. Connects to itself, but it's not touching this. It doesn't touch the alpha. It cannot touch the alpha. So it's not. It's just the alpha's through that hole. It's very strange how this metaphor can be applied to so many things. So it's going through, but it is not touching. You can't touch. So yeah, there's two gaps in the circuit. Here there's the gap's wider, and here the gap's smaller, which is the omega ring, which I'm drawing now. It's the same size as that one's supposed to be, and the circuit connects to that as well. So that's the circuit of the whole system. That's the electrical circuit. That's the wires. Ether runs. Copper conducts ether, but not like electricity. I think it's not going to pass through the copper. It will travel on the outside of it like a current. But basically, that doesn't matter really how it travels at the moment, but it does. Just to bear in mind, if I forget later on, the wire between here and here, between here and here is all insulated. This system here is all bare copper, but when it's from this point through the system to this point, it's insulated. But here this whole thing is bare. It's bare, must be exposed to the vacuum. So this is an expanded view of how the system works. The ether is coming in to the system. It's coming in, being pumped in by, I'm going to repeat myself because it might take a while to grasp. It's being pumped in by the frame. It's going to the center of the pyramid as it's attracted to, because it's pumped into the system. Let's say the alpha tip picks it up because it's sharp. Remember, sharp points attract and round points neutralize or repel. It's running down the alpha, both sides, goes to the ring, which actually sort of stops it from leaking because it's round, it doesn't have any sharp points on it. It's running through the system in series, and the first path it's going to take out of two paths, there's two paths here, is this ring. And there's a reason for that. But basically, it runs through this ring and then jumps back between this point and this point. So it jumps across the gap where the circuit begins and ends, and it keeps going round the merry-go-round like that, choosing this path to start with. So basically you've got your energy in and your feedback. So it's not vortexing yet. Now, the way this works is there's a gap in the gap here is at a certain diameter, and this is why there's so much argon in the pyramid, and the vacuum is at a certain level. Basically what happens, without explaining it in detail yet, this germanium box starts the system because it's a high voltage cell. It's not a battery, it can't be a high voltage battery, it has to be a high voltage cell because it has to collect like light and energy at the same time. It can't be just light and electricity. It can't be just electricity. It needs to collect energy as well. Otherwise, the electricity is not going to do it. But basically, the ether is going to be influenced by the electricity. So, to try not to get too complicated, the electricity jumps between this point and this point when the vacuum is at about 1,000 microns, predominantly argon, in the pyramid, and at a certain diameter, which is like between 6 and 10 millimeters, the spark will jump at about 260 volts DC. Whoops, the zero is supposed to be zero there. So 1,000 at the point where the pyramid's at 1,000 microns, with its argon remainder in the vacuum, 1,000 microns is 99.9%. You've got argon, 1,000 microns in vacuum. You've got the gap between 6 and 10 millimeters in diameter, and you need at least 260 volts for the arc to jump between here and here, these 2 points. So the circuit's going to run following this path to start with, but the second path, once the pyramid has accumulated enough energy, you can switch it to the second path, which instead of running through here, it's going to run through the coil, but at the same time it's going to be powerful enough to just attract ether to the tip anyway. So it's going to run a dual path, but the energy is going to run through this system that's feeding back, and the new energy coming in is going to go through this tip. So it changes paths, and the way you achieve that is you increase the vacuum to about 99.99%, which is about 200 microns, and because this gap is at a different distance, being closer together, like 4 mils, 3 mils or something like that. This is all the tuning which has to be done to get it started. Because the gap is smaller for this between here and here, it's because the distance of the gap changes the voltage that you need for it to jump across. So simply by increasing the vacuum 200 microns, 99.99%, the energy is not going to want to jump from here to here anymore. It's going to want to jump from here to here. So it's going to choose this path. It's going to change paths and then jump across here and continue the circuit. And by this time, what's happened is the energy is running through the circuit, and what this coil does is it vortexes the energy. This one just sends it across, so it can be influenced to be sucked in through here. This coil starts to vortex it, and that's how you perpetuate the energy rather than just feeding it in and not achieving much but just accumulating the energy. It vortexes here, and the vortex is where the self-perpetuation comes into it. Provided the whole system is not under resistance and it hits the threshold that it has to, it will become sort of alive. The whole system will come to life and become very powerful to the point where you have to actually restrict it, because that's how it works. It's a flip side. Nothing happens and all of a sudden you've got like a monster on your hands that's trying to get stronger and stronger and stronger. It would, if it wasn't restricted, the whole system would break down and melt. It would become very hot and it would be like a meltdown. But there's restrictions in place which have to be there anyway, which are explained later on. But basically, so what you've got happening here is the first section. Again, the first path, which is between here and here, you've got energy coming in, it's going around the circuit, it's jumping across. That's to pull up energy within the middle. The second one, and it goes is jumping from here to here, while at the same time more energies are feeding in. Sorry, repeat that. Energies, the second path, 1, 2, the second path, the energy is coming in here. It doesn't need to jump from here to here anymore because it's coming through the tip the way it should. It's going down the circuit and it's vortexing. So the first path is just to start to pull up some energy. The second path is to vortex the energy so it can perpetuate more and really build some power. Once it's vortexing, this system's going to suck in heaps of energy because it can, whereas in the start, the ether wasn't as encouraged to move up this tip at a fast rate. When it's vortexing, it's like a vacuum sucking heaps of energy in from the pyramid and from the surrounding environment or the aura, etc. And it becomes very, very powerful. The third, what you do once it was really started up is you have to bypass this component, which I'll explain later, is where you just bridge with a relay or something somehow. It's not hard to set up, but basically you'll have to bridge this so this component's bypassed, because this component will heat up and break down if it's not bypassed, and it also will resist the system a bit. So you can bypass the whole thing so the energy can just freely run around the circuit, because you don't need a starter anymore to start the system. You don't need energy coming in here to start the system. It will just do its own thing because it's already started, and it's spinning fast enough to gain its own momentum. It's become stabilized because of the vortex, and basically it doesn't need this, so you bypass it to stop the resistance. And the system is, when it's running properly, is running it, the energy is coming in, it's running down the circuit, it's running bypassed, and it's keeps going down the coil and recycling as it's coming in. So I hope that made some sense, but on a really, like, yeah, all there is to remember is that there's two pathways. Starts just going down here and jumping across here. The second pathway is still, it's constantly feeding in, but it's not jumping from here to here. It's running down the circuit and it's feeding back using the pathway of the coil and vortexing up into a ball of just craziness. In the center is just pure pressure, heaps of etheric pressure, pure potential to do things with, and that's where the quartz comes in to oscillate the pressure. But more on the actual design of the that's sort of the circuit, which I'll explain later again in more detail, but basically that's just so you can understand the feedback system expanded, because it's very important to understand that, because that's the key principle of how the pyramid builds up its powers. And basically, I'm not sure if there's another system where I explain later on how the energy is released through a hole, so it doesn't deadlock, or so it won't deadlock, and so it won't stagnate. It's a zone in between. So that's the Alpha Omega sort of energy system, and what the symbol actually does and why it does it. Because it's the law of opposites again. But the actual design itself, I'm just checking this. The 2D design is like this. There's the rings. You see there's the rings, which I haven't explained, but I can now. The top and bottom rings of the circuit are part of a sphere. This is not going to be right, because I'm not a machine, but it will be roughly correct. So basically, you see those rings in the pyramid, which you can refer to at any time. This is a cross section, and what those rings are, they do several things, but basically they balance the system, because the omegas are opposites from it. Alpha and omega are opposite from each other, and they're two halves of a mirrored system, two poles, but they're just the rings to stabilize that system. These two are one above the other, with the alpha connected going through the omega, like yay, hey, whatever. This is going to be an accurate representation. If I can, yes, like this sort of, the alpha omega, yeah, as it sits, like, it's attached. There we are. That, if it can be seen on the camera, is how it sits. And these two rings are what we're talking about now, which the alpha is connected to the top, the omega is connected to the bottom. You've got your gap here and your bottom connection, and the gap between the two. So, yeah, these rings do several things, but they basically mount the, let me draw this. They basically mount the alpha and omega. They have to have a reference point, you see, and they have to be fastened to something solid, and they're fastened to these things. The two rings. The rings are like the borders of the circuit, the first borders, and invisibly there's a sphere that fits perfectly within the cross section of these two rings. And what these little concave pieces on the rings do is block the energy from expanding to a certain point. So they act as reflectors and mirrors to a degree. Even being as thin as they are, they're very efficient at they're incredibly efficient at doing what the reflectors do. So if there's two layers of the system where there's two sets of reflectors, these are the inner reflectors, these two rings, and the silver discs are the outer reflectors, which contain any lost energy from this system. Any energy that makes it past those rings is blocked by the secondary system. And this specifically, the lower reflector reflects it to the crystal, as was explained. But basically, the gap is here. This is a side view, remember. The two copper rings are here. It goes through the circuit, which I'm not going to draw. And so that the wire is connected to the ends of the rings. So I'll just draw the circuit outside of where it's supposed to be. Say if it's running through the system, through the magnet, through the tube, through the other magnet, and then through the box. It connects back to this ring, as in the previous circuit, goes through the coil, the galaxy coil, practically it's what it is, and is also connected, well, it's connected logger ring, but also there's a gap, remember, here. This is where the gap is, as was filmed earlier on, with the large gaps here, and the smaller gap is here, to be able to change between this circuit, running through the ring, jumping up the tip, to this circuit, the galaxy coil. It looks like a galaxy in this drawing. The vortex coil. The coil is to vortex the energy. Also, I forgot to mention that there's the way this coil, just quickly, is configured, because I'm sort of forgetting things, but I want to put them in later sections, but I can forget. I'll explain it anyway. The coil has a weird kind of pattern on it, which actually helps grab the energy, rather than it just being like this is just a nice coil. The ether, if you want to manipulate it, you have to sort of grab it by making a weird sort of pattern through the coil and on the outside of the coil for the optimum design. So if that's coiling in, so that it can grab the energy and influence it as well. You know, so it's sort of like it's sort of like creating as much friction as it can, but only to the energy. So say if you've got the energy here doing its thing or being influenced, this extra friction that set up by having these fins on it, sort of like, what's a good analogy? A fan, for example. It's like, yeah, the analogy is like a fan with flat blades opposed to a fan with curved blades. The curved blades are going to be able to grab the air and push it, whereas the flat blades would just be pointless. They wouldn't, it'd slip past. It would, as in like, it wouldn't influence it. Once you've got a bit of friction set up, then you can grab the energy and spin it. So the coil has these things on it, which I'm not being very specific. It's because I haven't completely refined this aspect. These are just the more subtle things to grab the energy more efficiently and spin it, rather than letting it slip by inefficiently. Then your system's not going to load up. It's almost like the fins give it a bit of load and a bit of so I can grab onto it rather than, yeah, literally grabbing rather than slipping. So that's the nature of the that's a bit more detail of the Omega coil. So I don't forget the Omega. Did I finish with this? Yeah, so basically on a 2D view, the rings are as explained. And I'm going to be putting up a side view picture on the screen, which is a 2-scale representation, which is accurate to how all this should sit on a 2D level. Because I've drawn it sort of 3D, but it's actually all 2D. Is to get the accuracy of everything. But yeah, so the Omega's grabbing the energy, sending it back through here, constantly recycling as it's being fed in here by the pyramid, which is getting its energy coming in at all angles and whatever. It's not just linear, the whole thing is sort of, it does what it wants. It's very very organic actually. It's not just electricity running through a circuit and that's it. It's funny. It's like a conscious system. So it can do what it wants. It actually, there's leniency for random occurrences. But yeah, the energy's coming in, going up the needle. When it's fully working, it's going vortexing, which only brings in more energy. Like a galaxy, it wants to come in, it starts becoming very powerful. And yeah, you've got all your potential, you've got all the power in the world then. You've got power, true etheric power, 10 million times more than when it began. It's exponentially increases in power as much as you want, until the elements would physically melt, which I guess is the universe's way of protecting, because once the elements is melt, even when the elements are all melted, there'd be still a ball of energy spinning for ages. It would continue to spin, and it would take a while to slow down, I guess, because it had been spinning so fast, built up so much momentum. So that's sort of like, that's the alpha, and what I've explained really focused on is the 2 rings, the alpha, the omega, and their function. I haven't included the circuit or other parts of the circuit yet, but which come later. But that's how the energetic system of the pyramid works, and how the alpha and omega create that, as well as these rings here. And if you think about the system, once you get it, the whole thing is ingenious. Remember, it's not my design, but I figured out how it worked by having the design, obtaining the design, and it's so simple. It's marvelously simple, but all powerful. Very powerful. Also very hard to build accurately, and remember, this invisible sphere here is kept in place, this is the major ball of energy is trapped within this sphere by the slight curvature on these rings here, which the diameter here is I haven't specified, but there's a bit of leniency between that, but the lower diameter should come in near contact with that point. The high diameter, you can't make it too high because it will start interfering with the energy coming in. Has to be sort of just right, but that art hasn't been completely refined yet, because it's not strictly adhering to the laws of how it works. You just have to make it not to interfere with the energy. So the thickness, if it's too thin, these reflectors aren't going to work properly. If it's too thick, it's going to block some of the energy coming in, or the energy can move around it, but it just doesn't like to be too interfered with. It might decide not to run up that vector if you put a block in front of it. I had to file mine down a bit because there were 2. I designed them up to sharp points, and they were too high, so I just ground them down a bit here, and to a height which I didn't use the science to figure that out. They just looked right to me. I did actually. I looked at one of the vectors coming into the pyramid and made sure that there was at least 12 mils gap between the vectors that go to the center where the energy comes in and here. Another thing that's important is that the angle of the alpha and omega, because I'm going to Side view, it looks like this. The angle, quite simply, follows the angle, the same angle of the vectors of the pyramid. It follows the same angle. It's all simple stuff. It follows the exact same angle, which you'll find the vectors are actually higher, because this is not the center of the pyramid, it's actually here, roughly. The center of the pyramid is, the center of the energetic is here, because so the vectors can run past the rings without bumping into them, and for multiple other reasons, which I'll explain. I'll redraw this many times, focusing on different parts of the circuit, because it is complex, but once you understand it, it's nice and simple. But it's still a bit technical. So, the angle, and the drawing, again, I'll explain. The drawing that I put up repeatedly, that's the CAD drawing on the 2D view, zoomed into different parts, is to scale and completely accurate as to where everything, so you can use that as a legend. Even if the quality of the video is a bit low, you can use that as a legend and redraw it in CAD yourself, because the angles and the scaling is not going to change. It's going to be the same regardless. And you'll find, if you truly understand how this stuff works, you'll very easily find, like, if you can't find it, then you're not understanding it, but it's very simple how it works in following the invisible vectors and axes, etc. So it's basically the alpha omega function and the setup of it. Yes. Right, the next system we're going to talk about is, I'm going to make it two things in conjunction with each other, which are overlaid with each other. Number one is the magnetic void. And what this does is, by using magnets, you create a void. You're using magnets, manipulating them to create a void. And the void being a place of stillness, a zero magnetic field, which is, and before I understood all this, I used to say to myself and others, as one of the laws, which isn't quite correct, but I said you have to cancel out the polarity of the third dimension to access the fourth. And some of that's true, some of it doesn't make sense, but basically, to a degree it's true. You need to cancel out the laws of polarity to the nothingness to get to the nothingness, to get to the ethers, in a way. And number two is the loading coils, or the pump coils, which pump energy out of help to pump energy out of the ether. They do many things actually. They pump energy into this system once it's been converted, because it's converted from that spinning energy into a different form. Two is to let me just check something. Yes. Two is to tune the oscillatory circuit. LC, it's literally equivalent to it's an oscillator, an electrical and etheric energy oscillator. They discharge the energy as well, but basically the focus is to pump it, which is the load. They sort of, you can load them up and they will pump the energy, and they oscillate. They act as an oscillator. Everything has a dual function, Think of the pyramid as a system, an electrical system, or a system which runs off our physics, but it also, the same components run off etheric physics. So it's doing two processes at the same time. It's transducing between the ethers and here, or the dimensions in here, the finer subtle ethers in here, because it is two systems overlaid over each other. One abides by our physics, and the other abides by ether physics. And keep that in mind, it's very important. It's a mirror between dimensions. It's mirrored between the ethers and the dimensions. So I used to write it like this, which is not quite correct, but part of the pyramid is third dimensional, the other part is fourth dimensional. And they're overlaid and work in harmony with each other. So they work in harmony with each other, and they have to do that, or else they'll conflict and decide not to work at all. So, yeah, this symbol, overlaid and working in harmony, basically. Keep all that in mind. But yeah, going into the magnetic void. Basically, to start with, the principle of the magnets, when you get two magnets, magnetic fields, and they're nice long magnets, and there's a reason for that. That's because of the tube length as well. It's the most efficient shape to have when you've got a tube. The magnets are pointing in the same direction. They're both pointing in the same direction. They're opposing each other. Well, they're cancelling each other out. You see, the field normally runs, around like this, each magnet, and then it tries to run here, but it does run up, but right here, and it's only a few atoms thick in the very center of the two magnets, which, if you look at these are from an ancient experiment, but silly me, they have coils around them, as do the ones in the pyramid, positioned like that, and in the very center, they're positioned accurately, so you can know exactly where the action's going to happen. The very center of this is a still zone, which is called the void, the nothingness, and it's not very wide at all, but in that nothing zone, where the fields are zero, pretty much, because they're beside each other, and that, when magnets repel, that repulsion, in between that repulsion is a void, a still zone. And what the still zone does, in terms of the pyramid, is encourages the ether will pop through the point of least resistance, which it will pop through, in other words, the still zone. So these coils are actually focusing, because these coils are placed near the hot spot of the pyramid. If you've got your energetic center, you've got your vortex center, the coils are placed near both centers. So whatever energy and all business which is going on here and here, because there's three major hotspots right next to each other. You've got your vortex, galaxy coil, vortex coil, the center, the harmonic center of the pyramid, and your tube, which this void here is the weakest. It almost, think of it as putting a crack into the other dimension, like a little window, so small, but any pressure that's coming from that dimension is going to pop through into this dimension because you've set up a weak spot with these two opposing magnetic fields. So it's going to, without doubt, pop through here. And it's easy to line up, but if you've lined all this up correctly, it's going to pop through. The energy which is near all this in the other dimension is going to pop through into this one because of the weak spot set up by the voids. And so what do you place right over that void is the tube filled with mercury and salt in the vacuum. Oh, you can't see really properly, but because that tube is a transductor between, and it transduces, it'll be explained later, but it transduces between a pressure wave, and when it's put under pressure it creates an RF, it creates an electromagnetic wave of all spectrums. I've tested it, and you can use it from 0 up past light. It will transduce all of those frequencies. It's a super broad spectrum transducer, and this area basically is where most of the energy pops into this reality, and this is the area which transduces between our aura, because remember, both these are working side by side, but our perceptive, the reality we perceive is where the energy is, where this energy pops through into. So in between these two coils you have the void, and over the void you plump the tube filled with salt and mercury, which is a broad spectrum interdimensional transducer which transduces between vibrations to electrical RF. So basically, on a side view, do the coils. I'll do that later. You've got your, so position of the pyramid, you've got your harmonic center, let's say here. You've got your energy, your vectors, your energy vectors here. You have your alpha, this is the center of your alpha omega. So that's centered there. You've got your alpha going down here. You've got your omega coming up here. Now, where the pyramid is, this is how you calculate the exact position of all this, of the two void magnets. There's in this vector here, energy vector, you move down to the level which is level with the center of the alpha omega outer rings. This is the same way the Giza pyramid works. If you put the Giza pyramid in CAD and move this energy vector up to the center, the king's chamber and the sarcophagus of the king's chamber follows this energy vector. It's right on the vector of this main energy stream. Anyway, basically, this may not come out right on the drawing, but basically the two coils are perpendicular to this energy vector angle. The two magnetic voids. The two magnetic voids run perpendicular to the angle of these vectors, which is the same angle as the alpha and omega. So you run it. It's really easy to design this in CAD, and again this picture, which will keep coming up, has the 2 scale exact coordinates of all this. So basically, and the distance is, you have to tune that, but the distance must be equal regardless. So basically the first magnet is just above the alpha, the second is below the I think this is correct. I mean, it is, but let me just check something. It is, yeah, it's below the omega. And the tube is in between. It's on this energy vector. So you have the equidistance between the tube, putting the pressure, or the negative pressure, creating the void for the energy to pop through. It's focused right over the tube, which is accumulating energy from the energy which is being sucked in here, the harmonic center, and sucking, and the pressure inside the whole system is part of it is popping out because of the void you've created here, basically, and it's going to pop out sort of like an ellipse shape, because it's going to also be encouraged, because it's in exact alignment with this energy vector here. So you've got like a hole, a crack in the time-space continuum. And then you've got your transducer action going on here, which I'll explain in the next segment, basically. So that's the second principle of the coil. It's really simple, I'll explain it later, is that the coil, the magnets, two magnets, I'll draw it again. You have your little void here, it's just thin. You have your tube. They have the coil around them, as was explained. They do have a coil around them, which is the same, they're both opposing coils. Also, the windings are, interesting. The windings start loose, they go really tight, and then they go loose again. And that's because the center of the center is where all the action is. You want the greatest load here. Now, you've got to tune all this stuff, but this is just the basic framework. And the coil function is to oscillate the system, but also pump it, which is basically taking advantage of, as it oscillates backwards and forwards, the opposing field to the coil, to the magnet. That effect of pressure encourages energy to leak. The oscillations of the coil opposing this field, that effect encourages energy to actually leak through from the other the non-perceptive dimension, the fourth dimension, where the subtle ethers are, which are here but not here at the same time. So that's that explanation. 3. 1, they set up the void. These are just the magnets. 2, they're tuned so that they can oscillate in the oscillatory circuit. And 3, they act as a pump to let, by oscillatory action, let energy leak. More energy is encouraged to leak through each time it oscillates and hits equilibrium. More leaks through, and it just acts as a sort of pump to extract energy from the vacuum, speaking in terms of how 0 point works in that way of explaining things. So that's these 3 functions are what the magnets and the coils around the magnets do. The magnets, the coil, the coil. So that's basically it for your void and the coils around the void. Now we've come to the next section, where we'll be talking about what was first and originally known as the file. Which, what I've done here is this design is out of the Daniela's pyramid, so it's got nothing to do with the Arcturian pyramid. It's all, it's all different. These coils are. This represents the same principle, though. These coils represent the void. They're not in the right alignment, but just as an illustration, you've got your two coils opposing each other, and in the middle you have this, which is the file. And what basically this component is sort of in a way equivalent to, it's very close to the heart of the pyramid. It is practically the heart. It's not the center of the vortex, it's not the center of the pyramid, harmonic center of the pyramid. It's the center where everything happens. It's the center, it's where the fire is. All of what's set up in the pyramid is focused on 2 points in the pyramid. The first one is the tube, the file, and the second one is a quartz crystal, which is higher up in the pyramid, that the concave mirrors are focused on. But this is where all the fire and the energy is. And basically this file, it's just a tube. It's a quartz, you just make it out of quartz. This one's homemade. But it does work. It's a tube which is filled with about 70% salt crystal, rock salt crystal. I grow my own crystals. You can see them there in this bag. I grow my own and dry them out, and so they're very, very sensitive, because you need good quality crystal. To build the pyramid properly, you buy high grade salt, which you can. It grows in a cube when it's grown properly, and it's highly piezoelectric. So it's about 60% salt, I think, and about, if you fill it up vertically, it's about 75–80% mercury. There's mercury in here, and you probably can't see it, but there is mercury in this tube. I'll just see if it's hard to see. And basically, I'll just move these out of the way, give it some light. Basically, so you have a tube, which is can be made many ways as long as it's sealed. It's filled with salt, crystal salt, and mercury. It's under vacuum. The optimum vacuum for this tube is about 150 to 200 microns. So about 200, 150, and basically the inert gases in here are argon and neon. About 75% argon and 25% neon, and 25. So that's basically the tube. It has 2 platinum electrodes in either end. These aren't to extract electricity, but it conducts all through the mercury. It does. It's basically almost 0 ohms. It's direct conductor through the mercury, so the mercury has to touch the platinum electrodes, and the purpose for this is not electrical, but so that the energy can pass through this tube. It's for energy, and this wire is insulated. It shouldn't be. It should be. I said it was supposed to be, but it's probably better if it's bare. It has to be insulated around the coils, but it's probably better if just up close to the tube it's bare. So basically, that's the tube. Salt, mercury, 150 to 200 micron vacuum, which is 99.99%, argon and neon remainder inside. And basically, what this tube is it has a miraculous property, and that is, this is what's strange, is the information for this. I didn't have to figure out how to build this, because when Daniela had a transmission, the alien extraterrestrials said, the first thing it said was how to build this, because this is, and strangely enough, built exactly to those instructions. It bears a very interesting effect. And what it does, as I explained before, is convert pressure. I'll just put it across here. So it has room. Pressure waves. How do I draw pressure waves? I used to do this. It converts pressure into into all the frequencies ranging from 0 up to light and above light. It transduces pressure into RF, radio frequencies, light frequencies, electromagnetic frequencies, basically. Not electricity. Electricity does not come out the end. It doesn't work like that. But basically what happens is, first of all, it's the transducer in the pyramid which allows the aura to be picked up so that your aura can interact with the system. It's like, as Jan put it, it's like the microphone plus the speaker all in one. It's really interesting, all the functions it does. It does so many functions. Because any disturbance in the system, it's going to pick up. And the disturbance is the information coming from your aura. It's going to pick up, it's going to put it into the system, and it's going to amplify that disturbance. And it does that, as I said, it converts pressure into RF. It doesn't go back the other way. It only goes forward. And then it's sent back a different way, but not through the mechanism. Basically, pressure into radio frequencies. So the pressure happens in another dimension where the subtle ethers are, and it pops out, because of all of which has been set up in the pyramid, into this dimension as RF. And the way it does that is, the components in the pyramid being the salt crystals, the combination of the salt plus the mercury plus the vacuum create a very special effect. And that is, the pressure in the other dimension coming in hits the salt crystal, it distorts it, creating a piezoelectric charge. And as you'll notice, there's thousands of little crystals in that tube, and they have an optimum diameter of about 2 mils, between 0.5 and 2 mils, where they most efficiently work for the spectrum required. The size of the crystals determines the frequencies they'll be most susceptible to, but technically they transduce all frequencies. They can transduce all frequencies, having more stronger and weaker spots. But the energy's coming in from the fourth dimension. It's putting pressure in the fourth dimension on these crystals, and what happens is the crystal in that other dimension, because it's so violently being pressurized, is affected in this dimension. And that's where you get the piezoelectric charges happening off of the crystal. And the mercury basically supports that charge, and through a very strange process converts it into RF. The pressure on the mercury and the charge coming off the crystal creates, and the aid of the vacuum, so that the arcs jumping across can easily jump, because through the vacuum they can easily jump between each other. You get the RF frequencies, and so that's basically how the tube works. These three almost like a triforce. These three, salts, or just crystal, mercury, Hg, and the vacuum, create this transducer. Transducer converting pressure to RF. That's what it does. That's all it does. Pressure to RF. The pressure being the fourth dimension, the radio frequencies, the vibrations in the fourth dimension, and the pressure vibrating the crystals creates RF in this dimension. So basically, that's what the tube does. It's and I can tell you, I've built these. This one actually works, and this is what's so interesting. They actually do work. They're not useful for any applications that we know of because there's no wave we know of that can travel through things and vibrate them internally, because the wave would hit this. You could do that, but not you need a longitudinal wave, and a pressure wave that's longitudinal that can pass through things. So basically what happens is these longitudinal pressure waves, for me to imitate that, basically I make one of these tubes and I pull the vacuum. I keep the vacuum on for a long time because it dries out any moisture left over in the crystal, and if there is moisture, it won't work at all. The crystals need to be dried. So after about an hour and a half on the vacuum pump, if you you can build this yourself. It's like this tube's been sitting around for a while, so the vacuum's quite low in it. But basically, if you set all this up and you create the vacuum and the crystals are fine, the mercury's fine, and you shake it to create an artificial pressure on the crystals, it will, just a quick brisk shake will cause a flashing of light from one end of the tube to the other, where the pressure is impacting the crystals, and it flashes this sort of really, you can barely see it, but it's sort of not, it's not too dull. You have to be in a completely dark room, like pitch black. You need your eyes to adjust, and basically once your eyes are adjusted and you shake it like violently, just even if they're very sensitive, you can tip them up and down and they'll do the same thing. You'll see a really dull, it depends on what gases you put in there, but if it's just atmosphere, you'll see a really dull green light flash, and it moves down the crystal. You can sometimes even see little sparks, little hot spark points coming off the crystals. And it's really fascinating to watch. It's like magical, because it's like alive. You can make it artificially, bring it to life. And I just wanted to see the pyramid do that to the tube, because that would be so exciting. Because when the pyramid's working, this is flashing and oscillating to whatever thoughts you're having. It flashes according to your thoughts. It goes in rhythm with your thoughts. If I was speaking in my mind and interface with the pyramid, this would synchronize with that, is what Daniela witnessed in her dream. But basically, this if it has argon in it, it sort of flashes. The color is pretty much the same. It's a little bit bluer. It's not really bright or special. But what's interesting is neon. It creates a pink color, and it's brighter as well. And you don't even. It will actually produce an effect with a vacuum as low as 90%, which is very low. It will still produce the light, even with a really, really low vacuum. It's not that fussy, strangely enough. Can't be a really high vacuum because, again, the vacuum, it's like the pyramid, it can't be full vacuum and it can't be too low. There's a hot spot, but the range of the hot spot is very broad. You almost can't get it wrong. But yeah, the optimum is 200 microns with the argon and neon left over in there. But yeah, the tube does work as a pressure transducer. I've tested it as a microphone by putting a speaker onto it and getting it to transduce. The way I pick up the signal is I have a coil wrapped, just one coil, wrapped around the the tube and a wire next to it, and the energy coming off of it, and I run it into a phono input or a high resistance input into an amplifier and a speaker by vibrating it with, like, say if I put on its say if I put a tuning fork onto it, it will transduce very loudly and be easily picked up. And basically what happens is, like, it will pick up any frequency from 0. If you shake it, it will easily be picked up on the AM band on a radio. And it sounds like, when it's being picked up, it sounds like when you're listening to an AM radio and there's a thunderstrike and there's this, like, really crude, rough crackling, which is literally the sound of the crystals. And that crackling is the little sparks which happen that are jumping off the crystals. The discharge of those sparks is what creates that crackling. But at the same time, so you've got the spectrum already running from 0 up to the megahertz range and all the way up to light. So it transduces across all these ranges, which is so interesting because that means it will pick up any vibration in the ether at any frequency from 0 to light and above. I don't have the instrumentation to measure how much higher the frequencies it transmits can be, but I have no doubt that it can do all the way up to past ultraviolet and beyond, especially when it's being vibrated correctly, which I can't do, but the ethers can run at any frequency. And yeah, this tube is like, it's so simple, but it's so effective. It's truly extraterrestrial technology. Just by putting two ingredients together and having the vacuum, you get the most efficient transducer I've come across that can transduce pressures to radio frequencies, electromagnetism. So yeah, the tube's fascinated me. It's also fascinated a lot of people. No one's really done much experimentation with it. To me, it's very simple how it works. It's literally just a pressure transducer, but it's genius the way it does work. And that's the part that's special about it. It's so efficient to if ever you wanted to try and detect the ether, use the tube, because all the crystals inside of it, the many thousands of crystals, are all picking up slightly different frequencies, so you get an even spectrum of reception depending on what frequencies it's trying to intercept, and it makes it more sensitive as well. So it's more efficient because it's got so many crystals in it, and they don't need to be all lined up they just can float in the mercury. It's weird, when the mercury is at the right level, it's sort of, you can tell, because the mercury will sit about halfway up the tube when it's flat, and to calibrate it you have to move it backwards and forwards a fair few times because the electrodes need to touch. And when you put mercury in these tubes, the salt, it doesn't really like the salt, but eventually it will start flowing down the salt into the bottom, and that's when the salt crystals are nicely packed in with the mercury, and you can move it up and down, and the mercury will freely just move up and down the tube, and you put a multimeter on it and make sure that there's no resistance, because it's supposed to be a short circuit between here and here, pretty much, because it's to pick up energy. It's for the energy to pass through only. That's what it's for. But the actual energy, transducing it, is running through the tube like a standing wave, but also it's coming from the pyramid, putting pressure on the tube, because the tube's in path of the standing waves and in path of the vortex and everything. Anything that's going on, this tube hears it and relays it to RF frequencies that are perceivable in this dimension, can be easily measured. So I can only get a dull light out of the tube by shaking it, but when it's working in the pyramid properly, it's a very, very bright light, and it oscillates in rhythm with thought, or whatever the pyramid is feeding off of. Basically, the interrupted signal the tube intercepts, think of it as like a microphone, is visible by the light it emits. It fluctuates and flutters, just as if I was talking and had a microphone connected to an amplifier, and you have like the light display going up and down, getting brighter and dimmer at the amplitude of the volume. The tube does the same thing, but in a completely natural way, without amplifiers. It becomes everything. It becomes the amplifier, the transducer, the microphone. It's also the speaker. It interrupts the whole circuit. It's like, as I was saying with AM radio, it's the information wave microphone. It's not the carrier wave, which is the base oscillation of the pyramid. It's the information which it detects, and basically that's what it is. It does many things, but it's only doing one thing at the same time. It's just a very interesting component, and what's really super fascinating is it works if you build it. Anyone can build this, and you will see a result. Very easily to obtain a result, provided the crystals are completely dry, and they're not, provided they are crystals rather than just like overheated salt. And when you grow your crystals, they're even more sensitive. You'll get the light if you flash it, and the RF frequencies. As I was saying, it makes the radio crackle like a lightning strike if you shake it near the antenna, and you'll get frequencies down to just audible frequencies. So yeah, that's basically the tube. Base sort of drawn all over it. Oh, oops, I made contact here. Yeah, in regards to the circuit and where it's positioned, as I was talking about before, the tube, you've got the three spots. You've got the center of the vortex, center of the coil, the harmonic center of the pyramid, and the tube, which is in line with this. Horizontally it's in line with it, as you'll see on the drawing, but it runs on this energy vector. And remember, as before, the magnet's running perpendicular, both the same pole, perpendicular, equal spacing, with the tube in the center, creating the hot spot where all the action is. So all those longitudinal standing waves, the energies, everything as the systems, because it's doing its own thing, the action, the tube is relaying all that action and transmitting out heaps of different RF frequencies back into the system, interacting with your aura, doing all sorts of things, basically. So the tube's very easy to place at its location. I forgot to mention before, the magnet diameters and the tube diameters and the thickness, that's all like, you can adjust it. It's not set it as in one law. Some of the positioning is very close to the alpha symbol, particularly this magnet. It all sort of just fits. A little bit uncomfortable. You can bend this a little bit. It's not super fussy. It just fits depending on the distance between here and here. And the diameter of the magnets have to be, they're not yet fully known, but they're not, I know roughly what size they are, within a few mil. Same with the diameter of the tube. So you can't have too little space in there or too much, because it's going to interfere with the system, because the mercury in there is very dense. But there's a Goldilocks zone for it. I haven't yet worked that out. It's not really that important, and it's very easy to adjust the sizes very cheaply as well. Also bear in mind that the magnets have to be of one piece, and they can't be separate magnets stacked. It has to be made as one long rod. Otherwise the field will be broken and you'll get small fields circulating like this, and that's no good. It has to be just one field like this. But basically, going back to the tube, it's equivalent exactly to the King's Chamber in the Giza Pyramid. That's what it is. There's no Queen's Chamber for this design. It doesn't work like that. It's a different system. But this system, and the King's Chamber and the Giza Pyramid, is a bit lower down, but it's because it operates off a different system. But what's identical in the law is that it follows the energy vector. And it's on that line. In between, it's on this line, it's in between these two fields, equally spaced. It's in line with the center of the Omega coil, which spins counterclockwise from top down. I'll explain it later. And just above that is the harmonic center of the whole pyramid. So that's pretty much, there's details that are left out, but to get that thorough would take a very long time to explain. But that's basically the positioning of the tube file, whatever you want to call it, what it does, its magical properties, and the fact it practically, the easiest way to think of it after all is said and done, is that it's a microphone and speaker for the aura, or any information coming to the pyramid. It puts into the whole system and amplifies it, and also at the same time sends the signal back to you. So you're sending with your thoughts. So if this is the head of a human brain, you're sending your thoughts into the system, they're being sucked in by the pyramid, and you receive them back amplified. So it's a feedback system under yourself as well. It's going backwards and forwards, getting louder and louder and louder. It's feedback amplifier. So you've got the feedback of the energy, you've got extra energy coming in, and this, electrically speaking, this system between you and the center of the pyramid acts as a feedback amplifier, feeding back the amplitude louder and louder and louder. Whatever you think, you'll hear back in your own head straight away, almost like an inner voice. That inner voice is the power that's being transmitted into the quartz crystal, which is the way that the pyramid transmits out, which I'll get to it, because this is just the microphone and speaker. The oscillator is different. Thoughts in your head that are being transmitted out, you're hearing and the universe is hearing through a longitudinal standing wave containing your information, stabilized by an oscillation being transmitted far across the galaxy.